The big news this week on everyone's lips is IBM buying Red Hat. This is kind of a huge deal across not just the Linux and open source world, but the entire technology and software world as well. I want to talk about that a little bit and about the general trend of consolidation of power over the Linux kernel and open source in general in the hands of just a few very, very large companies, for better or worse. Now, this purchase is happening with an immense amount of money, an almost imaginary amount of money. A friend of mine a long time ago once talked about people who have millions and millions of dollars, nay, billions of dollars. And he made the point that as he counts money, he counts them like this. Oh, well, you get to 100,000 and that's amazing. You get to 1,000,000 and you're like, whoa, 1,000,000, 2,000,000, and then everything after that is simply many million dollars because it becomes such a large amount of money for most people and most corporations, let alone most governments. Once you get into the tens of millions, hundreds of millions, nay, billions of dollars, it becomes an almost difficult to fathom amount of money. And that's what we're talking about here. $34 billion in cash. This is based on Red Hat's stock price, and IBM is just flat out buying them out in roughly $34 billion in cash. And like most corporate acquisitions, which I've been through a couple of them in companies I've worked for in the past, there's a lot of good here and a lot of bad here, and a whole heaping helping of I don't know what this is going to mean, but it's going to cause angst. This is just how these things sort of go. So I'd like to talk through some of the more interesting aspects of this. We're not going to cover this entire thing in full detail here, just the parts that I feel really just deserve a little more attention. The first is this is clearly a very big win for talking about the value of Linux and open source and companies based on top of Linux, free software, and open source. And that's awesome. That's a pretty big win when we can say, look at that. This isn't just wow, Red Hat's going to pull in $1 billion this year? That's amazing. This isn't just, oh my gosh, Suze's pulling in $100 million over there. That's amazing. No. This is $34 billion in a cash purchase. Nobody, no matter how big they are, plops down $34 billion unless they perceive real, immediate, tangible value. And being as Red Hat's been entirely focused on free software, open source, and Linux for a long time, this is a direct approval of exactly that. And that's a pretty big thing for demonstrating the value of free software. Now, both Red Hat and IBM are among the top 5 contributors to the Linux kernel in terms of, lines of code and patches and number of people they pay to work on it. And that's great. I love seeing companies, big or small, dedicating funds and resources to open source, to free software, to Linux in particular. That's awesome. Now, what happens when a company that is, say, the number 4 contributor to the kernel buys a company that is currently, I believe Red Hat is the number 2 contributor right behind Intel? That combination puts them either tied with Intel or as the clear number 1 contributor to the overall Linux kernel. So this puts a lot of power in the hands of IBM over the Linux kernel. That could be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on how you view it, or it could just be nothing whatsoever. But it is something worth noticing, and I don't think I'm going to be the only one that notices that over the coming weeks. Now, one downside, and this has been talked about a bit by a number of friends of mine who have gotten a hold of me because they're with much gnashing of teeth thinking about this exact deal, is that Red Hat, over the last many years, has been a success story for us in the free software, open source, and Linux world. They are one of the first, or not first, but one of the major big players in the pure free software and open source foray. I mean, they just don't do closed source. When Red Hat occasionally has a bit of closed source code, usually because they acquired some other company that had closed source code, they either move to replace it or to open it pretty quickly. They have a good track record of doing that. In the past, I've pointed it out. Like I remember probably back in 2007, 2008, Red Hat acquired some company that had some closed source code to it, and I pointed it out on a show I was doing back then. I want to say within 3 months to 6 months, that was open sourced or in the process of being open source. That's the kind of company they are. So when we in the free software world are looking at Red Hat, they are kind of a shining beacon on the hill, or in the Carolinas, depending on how you view it. And they are an example of how successful you can be as a purely free software, open sourcey kind of company. That's no longer going to be the case. Now, Red Hat is maintaining a certain level of autonomy, right? The press releases from both Red Hat and IBM call out specifically, as well as one of the interviews that Jim Whitehurst, the CEO over at Red Hat, did, call out that Red Hat's going to maintain its independence. That said, they're still going to be owned and just a business unit operating inside IBM. And IBM is more of a closed source company than an open source company, right? IBM does a lot of open source, and they contribute a huge amount of money to open source, a huge amount. And to be clear, they also contribute a huge amount to open source and Linux marketing, so much so that there are actually examples of IBM getting fined because of their exuberant Linux marketing. They went around, I believe it was in San Francisco, they did an ad campaign called Peace Love Linux, and they went around and they kind of graffitied the Peace Love Linux little signs and logos. I think it was in San Francisco, and I want to say they got fined like $100,000 by the city, or it was one of the cities around there. And so I mean, they have some dedication to open source and Linux, but they're not a purely free software or open source company. They make a lot of money on patents. They make a lot of money on closed source. So now, even if Red Hat does maintain full autonomy, they're still part of a predominantly closed corporation. So they no longer are that example that we can hold up of, look how successful you can be without touching closed source code, right? They aren't that example anymore. That's kind of a bummer. Even if the company manages to keep, even if the business unit Red Hat manages to keep themselves fully open, they're part of a company that's not. That's a little bit concerning. And honestly, the odds of them maintaining full autonomy in the long run is almost zero. No matter what their intentions and no matter what IBM's intentions. I've been part of corporate acquisitions in the past, and even when the intention is that there will be no outside influence, there is always outside influence. I have never seen a single example in corporate history where there hasn't been influence from the company that owns you. It always happens. There's just no way around it. Hopefully it can be kept to a minimum, because Red Hat has had a lot of success and has given a lot to open source and free software. So hopefully it can be kept to a minimum, but kept to zero, not a chance. And realistically, the leadership at Red Hat and IBM have to know that. They've been around this game a long time. This is more messaging. They want to make sure the message gets out there that they'll still be doing business as usual to keep people from panicking. That's how you do this sort of thing. Having worked in marketing and PR and been involved in corporate acquisitions, that's what you do. Another interesting side note to this is that the corporate cultures of both Red Hat and IBM are very, very different. And I mean, IBM nowadays is not what IBM was in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. They're not the company that is always, clean pressed white shirts, clean pressed slacks, tie. They don't have, I mean, they still kind of do, but they used to have like these books of like songs and chants. I am an IBM man, those sorts of things. And IBM and Red Hat are just fundamentally different culturally. Now, this could be a good thing. This doesn't have to necessarily be a horrible thing. Red Hat could have a significant influence on IBM for the positive. IBM could have a significant influence on Red Hat for the positive or the negative. It could really go a lot of different ways, or it could simply be a bit of a cultural clash internally that we out here in the public never really see much of. But it's got to be something that people that at both companies are thinking about right now. I've talked to a few folks, a few friends at Red Hat. yesterday and this morning, and as we were talking about it, they all swore up and down they cannot talk to me on the record, and I get that. I'm going to honor that. I'm not going to reveal anything. However, these sorts of things are on people's minds. I think that's fair to say. I personally have not heard any panic. That panic might be existing, but I haven't heard it yet. So that's interesting. Now, the Linux Foundation, IBM sits on the board of directors for the Linux Foundation, much like Microsoft does, and VMware and a number of others. Now, to get onto the board of directors, I believe it is, I think it's $500,000 a year, something like that, is what you pay to Linux Foundation. Then you get a seat on the board of directors as a corporation, because it's a trade association. That's how the Linux Foundation works. Now, Red Hat, interestingly, is actually not on the board of directors for the Linux Foundation, which is in a way kind of fascinating, because when you look at companies that contribute to Linux, not just the Linux kernel, but the broader, say, desktop Linux ecosystem, the amount of things that Red Hat gives or pays for to be developed, developers of GNOME, developers of Network Manager, Wayland, and all sorts of things are happening thanks, at least in part, to Red Hat funding it, right? And yet they're not really even that high up. If you look at the Linux Foundation like tiers, they're like bottom tier or second from the bottom. They're just jumbled in there amongst 1,000 other companies that nobody's ever heard of. Is Red Hat. IBM's at the very top. But they are both corporate members. So now, assumedly, you'll see Red Hat drop off of there, and that maybe gives Red Hat a more prominent placement on the Linux Foundation board, because now they are part of IBM. Not really sure how that's going to work out, but it's something worth looking at as we go forward. Now, one thing that really jumped out at me when I read both of the press releases from Red Hat and IBM, which were very, very similar, this line: Red Hat to operate as a distinct unit within IBM's hybrid cloud team. Now, if you read through the press releases, very little was made of Linux. This is something that I think is worth noting and watching, based on indicating to us what the forward-looking strategy is from both IBM and the new Red Hat unit within IBM. They're focusing on cloud. I think the word cloud was listed in the press release about 11 bazillion times. They're very clearly betting the whole horse and the cart on cloud. That may not have any bearing on the work that Red Hat does related to Linux. It could be that because the cloud effort is so Linuxy tied, that Linux will just continue to receive all the benefits and the inputs and the resource allocations that it has received up till now because of that. We really don't know. It could be, though, that, I mean, clearly IBM isn't that interested in the Linux part of Red Hat so much as the cloud part of Red Hat, which, as a Linux person, I kind of sit back and go, whoa, really? To me, that raises red flags, but it doesn't have to be a bad thing. But it does raise red flags to me that the focus is so heavy on hybrid cloud. Think about that for a little bit, about what that could potentially entail, because it could entail a whole heck of a lot. Now, looking at the broader marketplace, SUSE recently announced, was it like 2 months ago, 3 months ago, that they are being sold to an investment firm, European investment firm. The investment firm, EQT Partners, they do things like they invest in companies that make boots and banks and stuff like that, right? It's a very diverse investment firm. And SUSE is being sold over to them and being bought out from Micro Focus. Now, SUSE has gone along, and they've had a couple of corporate acquisitions over the years. This is number 4 in the last decade, right? They went to Novell, and then they went to Attachmate, and then Novell got sold to Attachmate, then Attachmate got sold to Micro Focus, and now an outside investment firm is buying SUSE from Micro Focus, because Micro Focus, it looks like they could use the funds. And so SUSE is going to be more of an independent entity, but they're still going to be owned by a venture firm. I say not really a venture firm, more of just an investment firm. Now, Red Hat, who's been operating independently, is now going to be going from independent to simply a business unit operating inside one of the already sub-business units, the cloud business unit at IBM. So they're not even going to be necessarily reporting into the very top. How this is going to work, it looks like, since they're reporting already into the hybrid cloud team, they're going to be a couple of steps away from the top. So while they're huge, while Red Hat is gigantic and is going to represent a pretty massive amount of income for IBM, they're not going to be able to be calling all the shots, just looking at it from a structural point of view. And it does mean, though, that both Red Hat and SUSE are now not 100% independent firms. They can say things like we're operating independently, or we are not, we're able to run things how we've always run things, etc. But the reality is someone does own each of them. And so looking at that, there could be good, there could be bad that comes from it. And then you gotta pivot and say, what's going to happen to Canonical, right? I mean, in terms of the, enterprise Linux space, SUSE, Red Hat, and Canonical are kind of the big names that people tend to talk about in that regard. They're big in a lot of those ways. So I wonder what's going to happen there. I would be surprised if something doesn't happen pretty soon. Now, this is all way too big and way too complex to say this is just good or this is just bad. It's a mixed bag. It's very clearly a mixed bag. IBM has a long track record of supporting open source and free software. More open source, but both. They also contribute heavily to the Linux kernel and to multiple projects. That's a really good thing. I mean, this isn't like, a company who's just purely, this isn't like Microsoft coming down and buying Red Hat, right? This isn't like that. So, it could be worse, right? But on the other hand, this is clearly consolidating together a lot of the Linux work into one large shop. IBM and Red Hat, two of the biggest contributors, are now one thing. And that lack of diversity could be an issue. It's worth thinking about. And this is also not 100% bad. It also does lend a lot of legitimacy to free software and open source, as if we really needed it now. But it's still extra good. It is a success story, no matter how you look at it. So there is that. It could go a lot of different ways going forward, and I'm not 100% sure, and I don't think anyone else is either, including the people who probably made the deal. Now, here's what I think. Going forward. Number one, this gives IBM a huge amount of power over Linux-based systems. Huge amount. Because we're not just talking about the kernel here. We're talking about all of the projects that Red Hat sponsors and contributes to, which is a ton. When you fire up any desktop Linux system, there is fingerprints from Red Hat engineers and artists and testers everywhere. They have done a ton of amazing work for all of us, for the benefit of everyone over the last many years. This gives IBM a huge amount of influence, for better or worse. Also, Red Hat is undeniably going to be influenced by IBM because IBM owns them. They are a business unit of IBM now. It's sort of like saying, Microsoft Office will not be influenced by Microsoft. They're a business unit within Microsoft, so they're going to be influenced by Microsoft. Red Hat is going to be influenced by IBM. I would be very surprised, very, very surprised if over the coming years, names of products don't change. I will be changing, I mean. I'd be very, very surprised if the word IBM or some of IBM's keywords don't start sneaking into some of the Red Hat products. That just seems like a given to me. Brand synergy and all that. Plus, you're going to see more focus on interoperability with existing IBM technology. That just makes sense. That's just how it should be. The company owns them. They have that right? Which means probably less of a focus on working with some of the outside vendors. I mean, it just stands to reason. Also, Red Hat will in the long run focus more on the cloud and less on Linux. The press release was clear. This is about cloud. This is about their cloud services and cloud offerings. That's what IBM is buying Red Hat for. They made it 100% clear that that's not like a controversial stance I'm taking. That's not me being a doom and gloom kind of guy. That's just what the press release says. I don't know if that's really going to have a positive or negative impact on the broader Linux and desktop Linux ecosystems over the coming years, because the reality is there are other companies doing a lot of great work in that regard, and I would be really surprised if Red Hat stopped doing Linux entirely. I would just see their focus shift. It would be my guess. That would be what I would assume what would happen. And I really wonder what impact this will have on SUSE. Now, SUSE has been Red Hat's kind of number one competitor. Well, SUSE and Red Hat kind of operate in the same space. Enterprise Linux, enterprise hybrid cloud, software-defined storage. I mean, heck, SUSE's software-defined storage strategy is actually based on Ceph, which is owned and developed by Red Hat. If that, the two of them are very intertwined in so many ways from a technological perspective. And there have been many times when IBM will utilize a SUSE product for some of their things instead of a Red Hat product. Not always. When you look at the supercomputer space, for example, a lot of the supercomputers that IBM builds are based on Red Hat Enterprise. However, Watson, they're not their most powerful one ever, but one of the more famous supercomputers they built, that's the one that won at Jeopardy many years back, was using SUSE Linux Enterprise. What will that relationship be like going forward? If I were IBM and if I were Red Hat, I would see changes, at least slow rolling ones, away from SUSE. It also means that companies that do business with IBM are going to be more likely to now look at Red Hat as potential offerings instead of SUSE's. It just stands to reason, right? Whether IBM gives them deals to use Red Hat and little discounts here and there if they're already using, say, some of the IBM storage products and whatnot, or it's just because there are people from various third-party vendors are already sitting in a meeting with an IBM representative and they have an extra chance to be sold on the Red Hat offerings over SUSE's. I could see this being a very, very scary moment in time for SUSE, who I haven't worked for them for a year. I stopped working for SUSE last November, but I would be worried. If I were them, I would be mildly terrified would be a good phrase to put it in. I don't know that this necessarily spells doom and gloom for them. SUSE has a lot going for them in a lot of different ways, but this is a huge, huge challenge. And being as I haven't seen a whole lot of news come out of SUSE about, how they're going to combat that sort of thing, I'd be a little bit concerned. And I do expect an announcement from Canonical soon. I want to make this clear, though. I have no inside knowledge. Like, Mark Shuttleworth is not ringy-dingy to me on the phone and been like, "Yo, Lunduke, we being sold to Microsoft, son." Like, I haven't heard anything like that, right? By the way, that's totally how Mark Shuttleworth talks. But he does. And so, but I expect it to happen, right? I mean, Mark has hinted, hell, he's outright said in the past he's looking at, potential of IPO. They were trimming the fat. They cut the Ubuntu Touch. They just killed that whole product line entirely. They killed off Unity. They killed off all the products that weren't immediately successful pushing towards the enterprise space, which means, and they've been really vocal about talking about their partnerships with people like Microsoft. So I would, as well as IBM, actually, at a Linux Foundation event, I want to say it was LinuxCon North America 3 years back, something like that. Something like that. Mark Shuttleworth was on stage with people from IBM talking about some of IBM's kind of, not their supercomputers, but their big high-performance machines, their big, beefy data center racks, and talking about Ubuntu on those and how great that would be. So this is going to have an impact. The IBM announcement is going to have an impact on Canonical too, and I would be really surprised if Canonical either doesn't sell themselves to another firm, which Microsoft is the most obvious one. Secondarily is Oracle. I know, I hear screaming on the internet right now, but just looking at it from a financial perspective, those are the two companies that are most likely. Third most likely, I would say, would be maybe VMware, something like that. Anyway, so I would say those acquisitions are very possible. I would be really surprised if at least relatively high level conversations haven't been happening along those lines. Either that or an IPO. Canonical is going to be looking to make waves because at this point, they're kind of like the third dog in the enterprise Linux server race, and they're going to be looking to make a move. They have to make a move, and they have to make it now. Otherwise, they're going to be losing out a lot in terms of contracts, publicity, etc., to the Red Hat IBM juggernaut and SUSE, who, if they're smart, they're getting in on this and looking to make a move as well. So I would expect an announcement actually pretty soon. I would be really surprised if we get to this point next year and Canonical was a freestanding entity that was not either publicly traded or owned by another corporation. I'd be really, really surprised. Again, no inside information. This is just me looking at it as a person who's existed as an executive of software companies and within Linuxy companies during acquisitions. This is what I'm seeing. Now, like you can probably tell, I'm really torn on all of this. There's a little bit of good, there's a little bit of bad, and there's a whole lot of kind of scary, but potentially exciting, but also really scary, unknown fog out there in the universe. I don't know what's going to happen. It's going to be really interesting to watch it going forward. I would like to just say to all my friends over at Red Hat, I hope this works out really well for all you guys. I really, really do. And to all my friends over at Canonical and SUSE, hope you guys make a move pretty soon. Yeah. This episode of the Lunduke Show is brought to you in part by Pogo Linux. They have Linux in their domain name, and last I heard, they weren't being bought by IBM. They make huge servers, and they are truly glorious. Go on over to pogolinux.com. Check it out. Their software-defined storage stuff is just killer, by the way. Seriously, some of their storage stuff just is mind-blowingly like massive and impressive. I want them. I have no need for the kind of storage that Pogo Linux can provide for me. Like if I was like a mid-sized company or a big company, I'd need it, but I want it because I want to have a petabyte of storage at home. Like I just want it. Anyway, go check them out over at pogolinux.com, as well as Purism, who are dedicated to free software. Dedicated to it, so dedicated to it that they're building a phone that is powered by free software, which is awesome. A phone with hardware kill switches, no less. Go to Purism's website, puri.sm, to check that out, as well as their line of laptops. They're friggin' rad. And Lulzbot. They make 3D printers that make my heart go pitter-patter. They love free software. They even hold sales to raise funds for the Free Software Foundation. How cool is that? And they love open source hardware. These folks know where it's at. They're so dedicated to just open-y stuff. They fund shows like this, and they use my voice on their phone tree system. Craziness! Insanity! But awesome. Head on over to lulzbot.com to check that out. And if you want to find out more about this show, head on over to lunduke.com. You can see some of the past shows, some of the clothes I sell, because I sell clothes. I don't know. It's weird. Or you can go to patreon.com/BrianLunduke if you want the RSS feeds for this show in MP3 and MP4 formats. And if you want to read articles written by me, this just happened, this is a new thing, head on over to Linux Journal. I'm the new deputy editor over at Linux Journal. And, so you can get a subscription to Linux Journal and read random words that I plow out onto plow out? That's a weird thing to do with words, onto the keyboard. Anyway, go to check it out at Linux Journal. It's the longest running Linux magazine on planet Earth, which means it is likely the longest running Linux magazine, at least as far as we know, in the universe. That's pretty cool. All right, everybody, I'll see you guys tomorrow.